welcome to Stillspeakpod. So last night, I did a video, and in that video, I talked about all sorts of things, and at one point, I said that I wanted to talk about Northport Police, but then I said, we'll do that at the end, because I didn't want to get distracted from what I was saying at that point. Well, I forgot. So I ended the video and I'm uploading it and I was like, I forgot to go back to discussing the Northport Police. I was like, it's okay. We'll talk about it tomorrow. And what's crazy is that I had planned to come back to you tonight and finish off what I was trying to say about Northport Police. And right before, this is not even kidding at all, right before I was coming on here to do that, we got more information about Northport Police. And it fits perfectly into what I wanted to discuss last night. The odds of that is insane. So maybe I left it out and it was meant to be, because today we were going to get more information. So now I can include it. I don't know, but it worked out perfectly. I want to start off by saying this, and I've said it several times before, but I think it's important before I proceed. I'm a huge law enforcement supporter. Big law enforcement supporter. Back the blue, all about it, okay? Huge. Are they perfect? No. Are there bad seeds? Absolutely. Do they all suck? No. Do they all drop the ball? No. Are they all, in this big conspiracy and getting people off and charging the wrong people and all this other stuff? No. Do they get it wrong sometimes? Of course. They're humans, okay? But overall, I'm a huge supporter of law enforcement. And with all the cases that I follow, the great majority of agencies that get involved in a case or the local police do great jobs, and they're very thorough and they're very careful. There's only a select few cases I can think of off the top of my head where I was like, what the hell happened here? How did you guys screw this up so badly? And so it's not many, okay? The great majority of cases, law enforcement handles it perfectly. But then comes along a case that gives me pause to say, what the freaking hell is going on? This is one of those cases. And it's not just Northport. I've talked heavily about the Moab officers in my body cam 4-part series, okay? And I'm greatly disappointed in what has transpired through the Petito Laundry story. And today, the new information that we got today that I want to include with what I was going to talk about last night about Northport has me, I don't know the word to say here other than I'm pissed, okay? I like to be transparent, and I'm pissed. Now, I'm not going to go too much into it because I've said some of this stuff in other videos, but I want to talk about Northport PD. Now, this is all in my opinion, Northport PD. Don't come for me. Relax, Josh Taylor. This is just an opinion. Okay, you seem really nice, but there's a lot of things that makes me question you just a little bit. So, we start in Moab, in that whole scenario, okay? Look what happened. Both of them end up dead, which is just, I'm still processing that, honestly. I'm just mind blown by it. Not like, oh my God, I can't believe he killed himself. It's not shocking, not in that way. I'm just processing all that's happened in the last 6 weeks and the fact that we now know that they're both dead. It's just a lot to take in. So we're not even going to talk about Moab officers because I said more than enough in my 4-part series. So I'll leave them alone for a moment. But Northport, So on the 10th, after Gabby's parents were calling the laundry parents and nobody was calling them back, blah, 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 they tried to file Gabby as missing. Now, this is kind of murky. We haven't gotten like deep details on what exactly happened here, but it seems like they were trying to figure out where to file her as missing. And it seems like Joe Petito called Northport, and I guess Northport was like, well, we can't file it. You need to file it where Gabby's mom was, okay? But Gabby's mom went to the county that she's from, Suffolk County, to file there, and apparently it seems that she was basically blown off as like, Gabby's an adult, she's probably okay, and this is common in cases when it comes to adults. Cops usually are like, give it time, they're adults, they can take off on their own, blah, blah, blah. So we start with Northport not taking the report on the 10th, okay? Now that might have been protocol, that it had to be someplace else, but that's odd because Gabby was a Northport resident, or maybe she never changed her license. That could be it. She lived in Northport, but maybe she never switched her license over. I know you're supposed to do it in a certain amount of time, but some people don't. And if they get pulled over, they just pretend like, oh, I just moved here like 2 weeks ago. I'm not really sure. Maybe because it was Gabby's mom who wanted to file her missing, so it had to be in her county. I don't know. Anyway, the other day I said I wish they would streamline this a little bit more, that when you want to file somebody missing, it doesn't make it such a headache, and you're not getting like the rigmarole of go here, go there, oh no, you're supposed to call there, and then you call there, and they're like, oh no, you're supposed to call there, and that's really frustrating for a parent who's desperately looking for their child. But then on the 11th, she was able to find somebody at her police department to take her seriously and to file the report. Clearly, they're not going to fly down to Northport, so they contact Northport. Northport's the one that goes to the home. Great. They go to the home, and one of the first big red flags, because when they get this missing persons report, Nicole probably said, my daughter and this guy Brian, they went in this white van, possibly even gave them a license plate number, and I can't find my daughter. So what happens? The cops roll up on the house, and right away, you're going to spot this van. So, huge red flag, but at that point, they don't know Gabby can be inside, right? So they go, and they knock on the door. And allegedly, what happened was they were handed a note with Stephen Bertolino's phone number on it, and basically like, hey, call the lawyer. We've talked about this 1,000 times, that Joe Petito warned the parents the day prior that they were going to be calling the police, and so this is probably why they contacted their friend who's a lawyer and had him on standby in case that happened. We still don't know why. Let's not even get into that. Okay, great. But they're doing a wellness check for Gabby, right? And they have to know that the parents weren't returning her parents' call before they went to the house. So they go to the house, which was Gabby's residence. Her van is outside, so there's this possibility that both of them are in the house and maybe Gabby just didn't call her parents. But then they're handed the lawyer information, right? Which is a good sign that Gabby's not in the house, right? Of course. But at the same time, it's like, I don't know, were you looking for Gabby like over the dad's shoulder when he answered the door? Or did you just see the lawyer number and assume? Probably just assumed, because that's another red flag right there. So now you got this lawyer's phone number and you got this van outside, and now you got to go back and you got to let your boss know what's going on, and then they're going to have to tell this mother that your daughter's van's back in Florida, but they handed us a number to a lawyer, so I don't really know what to say. And we've talked on this channel a million times already about Josh Taylor. Now, Josh Taylor, okay. So, just to refresh your brain, for like 10 of my videos, I kept correcting everybody saying they did see Brian. They did see Brian. They did see Brian. They did see Brian. Because everybody kept saying that nobody saw Brian. But Josh Taylor said 3 different times. It was 2 times, and then he said it the 3rd time a different way. But he said, we saw Brian on first contact. We just couldn't speak to him, which of course, because of the lawyer number being handed to them. There's recordings of Josh Taylor saying that, okay? I played you a video of Josh Taylor saying that, so I'm not making this up. So it really bothered me when weeks later, after I said it over and over and over and over again, to hear Josh Taylor then saying, no, we didn't see him on first contact. I'm like, wait a minute. Am I losing my mind? Did I hear it wrong? What? So I had to go find the interviews where he said it, which Josh has given a lot of interviews because, you know, the reporters have been all over him. And I had to dig to find the 3 different times that he said it. So I just can prove to myself I wasn't losing my freaking mind, and I definitely heard what he said, okay? So then I found it, and I'm like, all right, I wasn't wrong. He did say this, so what the hell happened here? Like, was there some type of miscommunication? Did the officer say he saw Brian, and then later maybe the body cam footage, if it was on, proved that he didn't? Or maybe the officer was like, no, I never said that I saw him, and there was some type of miscommunication. Which again, they're human. Okay, I get it. But that's a pretty big deal. And that's a pretty big detail, right? Because you're saying that you saw him on the 11th. And now he's gone. And nobody knows when he really left. So now you're saying you don't know where he is. Or you didn't see him on first contact. That's a big deal. And that's a big difference. But to kind of throw Josh a little bone here, he's the spokesperson, right? So he's repeating what's being told to him, and I get that. I really do. So maybe that he was told something that ultimately ended up not being true, and so he kind of had to correct that. I had to pause for a few minutes because my neighbors sounded like they were having this massive party 11 o'clock at night right outside my garage. So yeah, back to Josh. So I give him a bone there because he is just a spokesperson, and maybe somebody gave him bad information. It's just really frustrating. So, Nicole tells them the story when she's, filing this report. So they're going to the house thinking like, we're going to be checking to see if we can get a hold of the parents because they're not calling her back. And instead, they get a surprise because the van's in the driveway, right? And then they knock on the door, and we don't know what was said or if it was immediately like, here's our lawyer, right, number. But what's interesting to me is you would think that in that moment, and they were considered like, okay, the van's here, and this guy's handing me a number. Was there any type of consideration that the parents had something to do with the disappearance of Gabby and Brian? That sounds crazy, right? But if you go to this home, you don't see the 2 people that you were told about, Brian and Gabby. You see the van, and you see the head of the household handing you a lawyer number. I have to wonder, did they consider that for like a split second? Because it appears that they assumed that Brian was in the home, because now we know that they didn't see them, even though they said that they did. So at that point, I think they just assumed he was in there. Now, like I said before, I follow many cases, and this whole idea that Josh was selling, that you can't do surveillance on citizens and you can't keep tabs on residents, I'm going to have to argue. I think he was trying to sell this point for whatever reason, and he had a motive behind doing that because of what we found out today, which we're going to get to. And I've seen in other cases where persons of interest, they do surveillance on. And the other day I said that, think about stings. They're watching residents, citizens, and they don't know that you're doing that. So you can do stuff like that. You absolutely can. So even back then, I wasn't really buying what Josh was saying, because I'm like, that's not true. Now, the whole Fifth Amendment, yes, absolutely. They have the right to remain silent. They don't have to say anything, etc. Sure, absolutely. But you can keep tabs on somebody. Now, in this particular case, this isn't a normal case, and I've said that many times as well. This wasn't like somebody went missing from their home or work or while out on a jog. This was 2 people left in a van. They were living in the van. The van is hers. They were gone. The van comes back, which was hers. She doesn't come back, and he does, or they assumed he did, okay? Like I just said, if they didn't see him on that first contact, then they definitely assumed that he was there. So right away, those are huge red flags. You got this van and you got a lawyer's number. You got a situation. Where the hell is this girl, right? So at that point, yeah, you absolutely should be doing surveillance, because now this guy is the only person who was last known to be with Gabby and was supposed to be living with Gabby in this van that's now sitting in the driveway. And at this point on the 13th, the story wasn't as massive as it became. It actually wasn't until the next day on the 14th that reporters started to stay outside the home all day. There was some local reporters who took a few pictures on the 13th of the police trying to get in contact with the Laundries and going door to door to the neighbors to ask questions. But then on the 14th is when the story blew up, and that's actually the first day that I started to talk about this case. And at that point, Brian was already gone for a day. And you can go to my timeline video that I just posted today that took me forever to figure out how to put a video with audio. Don't even get me started. So this whole idea that Brian took off on the 13th doesn't seem too far-fetched, because there wasn't reporters outside all day long. At the same time, many of us assumed that they would have been watching him. So when we later find out that he took off, that was like a mouth-dropping moment, because we're like, what the hell is going on? Like, what, how, who, what, where, when, right? Mind-blowing. We just could not even believe it, because the day prior to that was the press conference the chief did with Joe Petito, and he was asked directly, do you know where Brian is? He said yes. When they asked if he was at the home, he didn't want to comment on that. After that is when Josh Taylor started to say that they did see Brian on first contact. They just couldn't speak to him. And when they started the search for Brian in the Carlton Reserve, Josh Taylor did a small press conference and he answered some questions. And he was asked if he was for sure that Brian was in the home at some point. And he said they were 100% sure Brian was in that home at one point. Now, we don't know what happened with Brian. We don't know if he went to the reserve and immediately killed himself, which would have been the 13th. At this point, he was already dead for 5 days. And if you actually go back to that little press conference that Josh did in front of the reserve, it's actually not far from where Brian ends up being found, which is a little creepy. But let's go back for a second here. So the 11th, okay, originally said that they saw him, then they said they didn't see him. Okay, fine, whatever. The van's taken from the driveway on Sunday. We haven't heard if there was any type of conversation that day. Did they knock on the door and say, we're taking the van? Did they just roll up on their driveway and start towing it away? I have a feeling they at least knocked on the door to let them know, but we've never been told that. And we don't know, like, if they did they look inside to see if, like, Brian was sitting in the living room or anything to that effect. Clearly they didn't, but I'm just wondering if they did go to look. Not that they actually saw him, but that they tried to look and knock on the door again before taking the van out of the driveway. Which they wouldn't need their permission, but it is on their property, so I have to wonder if, like, they knocked on the door. So now we have Stephen Bertolino. And I said last night that he said in an interview 2 nights ago that he actually told his contact at the FBI that Brian went to the reserve on the 13th and he didn't come home that night. And he said he told them that on the 13th. This is massive. And Northport is arguing against this, but Stephen Bertolino said the FBI. So Northport disputing that and saying, oh no, he didn't call us. We checked everything. We went back. Well, he didn't say he called Northport. He said he called the FBI. And that he called a contact at the FBI and told them this. And then we have Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then on Friday, there was going to be a press conference in Wyoming at 6 o'clock, and 5 minutes before it began, it got canceled, and we were told that it was because the Laundries called Northport police and said that, they needed to speak with them. And I guess they were under the impression that they wanted to finally speak to them about Gabby, but when they got there, it was about Brian being missing. Well, Bertolino is now saying that what actually happened was that he told his FBI contact on Monday the 13th, and then days went by, and then on Friday the 17th, his version of events was that they contacted him. Now, I don't know if he means Northport did or the FBI did, but somebody contacted him and said, we have a tip that Brian was seen in Tampa and we want to make sure he's at the home. And I guess at that point he was like, I told you he didn't come home from the reserve on Monday night. And then they set up a time for the law enforcement agencies to go by the Laundrie home to speak with the parents, and at that point they asked the parents if they wanted to report Brian as missing, so they did. So we have 2 huge different account of events here, okay? So he says they called him, they say they called them, so now you can easily say, well, Stephen Bertolino has missaid a few things, or he corrected a few things before. Maybe he's wrong. Maybe this, maybe that. You might not believe him. You rather believe Josh Taylor. At this point, I don't know who the hell to believe, to be honest with you. I'm actually leaning on Steve with this. I really don't know why he would go into so much detail and say this if this is not true. And I said last night that if this is true, if they did let law enforcement know on the 13th that Brian did not come home, like, late at night. Wow. I mean, wow. Like, to the point of wow that they almost owe the Laundrie parents an apology. And I know, I just outraged a lot of people, whatever. Why? Why do I think they need to apologize? Well, if this is true, that means that law enforcement allowed the public to believe that these parents did not tell law enforcement that Brian was missing for almost 5 full days, which is what really bothered people. The first thing that really bothered people was obviously him coming home without Gabby. And then the second thing was the fact that they weren't answering the calls. But this idea that Brian, goes missing and these parents didn't report it for almost 5 full days really outraged the public. This is what started the extensive theories about them helping him to escape, because they were like, why wouldn't they report him missing for 5 days with all this going on and Gabby being missing? So this was really suspicious to people, and it could look suspicious, even though I felt there could be plausible explanations for this. But this is what really angered people. This is what really sparked outrage. And I'm going to say this. The night that police went to that home on the 17th, and this was all unfolding, just prior to the police showing up, there was all these protesters outside and blowhorns. And none of the chants and screams were directed at the parents. They were directed at Brian because everybody thought he was in the home. And it was after that the chants and all of that changed to being directed obviously at the parents, because now everybody knew Brian wasn't in the home. So this was a really big deal. So if this is true, this is wrong on so many levels. It's wrong because they caused a lot of outrage by not coming out and saying, well, we actually did know that he didn't come home on Monday night, and like calm the protesters down and the anger and the hate and the theories. They didn't do that. Now, is it their job to calm down the public? Well, when you have people outside disturbing the neighbors, taking over their neighborhood, cars parked up and down the street, and blowhorns being used, I'd say it would be rather fair to everybody involved to let that be known. So I'm really interested to see, because now Northport is like, no, that's not true. But Stephen Bertolino didn't say that he told Northport. He said he told the FBI. So now is Stephen going to counter that and be like, no, I really did. Here's the proof. I have it in text or a phone call or an email or something. And is he going to prove that they really did tell them? If he does that, I will just, I don't know, throw in the towel, give up, because that's just unbelievable to me. That's just crazy. And then from there, Josh Taylor said all sorts of things, right? Because he's the spokesperson. He gave so many different interviews, I can't even keep track at this point. He said a lot of different things, but I know for sure 3 times he said they knew he was at that home when they didn't know that. And we now know, because they admitted, oh no, we didn't see him. And then when he was talking to Brian Enton in an interview maybe like a week and a half ago, he said, well, I don't want to say too much because we already got ourselves into a situation saying something that wasn't true. Or he said something to that effect. So he's admitting that they messed up, right? Which is great. Please admit when you mess up. It's a great thing. So, he's repeatedly talked about he's only a person of interest, blah, 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 blah. And in the beginning, when Brian actually took off, they actually weren't even referencing him a person of interest. They kind of did a mix-up of words. And originally they were saying, well, he was the last person seen with Gabby, so he is a person we're interested in speaking with. And then it was like a couple days later that they actually started calling him a person of interest in her disappearance. And then later, in her homicide. And you got Stephen Bertolino saying that night when they came to the home on the 17th, they told them where Brian went and said exactly the spots that he would typically visit when he would go there. Okay? The next morning, they start this massive search for Brian. Massive. And that's when Josh Taylor's standing in the front entrance of the, I'm not even going to say it. I actually haven't said it on this channel one time. I just keep referring to it as the Carlton Reserve, because the name of the environmental park that's attached to the Carlton Reserve that he actually went to, the name is so freaking hard to say. Maikahachi, something like that, excuse me. So I don't even bother saying it. But anyway, he did his press conference in front of that area. And like I said earlier, that ended up being relatively close to where he was found. And we watched as Northport went from Northport side to the Venice side, back to the Northport side, to the Venice side, to the middle, back to the Venice side, to the Northport. And all the while, if they knew that he was relatively close to the entrance, because that's where the parents said they went, you gotta go like, okay, well, why didn't you search it? Okay, now they're saying it was underwater. Okay, great. Well, if Brian went out there on the 13th, when did the water come into play? Because did Brian go out there in this deep water and stand there and harm himself if that's what happened? Like, in water? Doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. I would think that the water came after the fact, but I guess it's possible he could have went and stood out in the water and did it if he did kill himself, which we don't know. And it does feel like they kind of skipped over it. They kind of just went, I don't know, they kind of just went to the middle and then just started from there, like as if he went really far into the reserve. Now, I guess you can say that the thinking was, well, it's been X amount of days. If he's in there, then he's traveled into the reserve. Okay, maybe. But then you went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and it is a lot of land, I have to say, it absolutely is. But they were using all kinds of equipment. My God, these insane drones, which I don't even want to know the price of. They're probably very costly. All types of different dogs, swamp buggies, airboats, helicopters, sonar, dive team. I mean, a lot. And for a really, really long time. And then you had in late September that the FBI took over the investigation and Northport kind of took a back seat, and that's when they said they were scaling back searches and only doing targeted searches based on intelligence, which I found interesting because it was at the same time that the FBI took over the investigation, and at that point I'm thinking, like, did they think that Northport was wasting their time searching the areas that they were searching? So then it was ultimately decided that the FBI was going to take it over, and once they took it over, they're like, we're not doing this anymore. We're not going all the way out in the middle. We're going to do only targeted searches based on what we know, and intelligence can be what the parents said. If they said, he usually goes here, he usually goes there, or if they found something that belonged to him, like a pen or a wallet, well, not wallet because he allegedly left at home, but, you know, some type of item, for Pete's sake, an ID, something. And then Northport kind of, you know, they went quiet. The FBI is always quiet. That's just the way they work. So at this point, you know, the FBI has been the lead investigation team for quite a while, almost a month, and I didn't really want to hear from Northport anymore at that point because they're not actually the ones leading the investigation. But Brian Ensign went ahead and interviewed Josh Taylor, which we really didn't get much information from him. He did a lot of beating around the bush, so on and so forth. Okay, great, wonderful. So now we're on October 20th, and the parents find, within the first hour of going out to look for their son after the reserve opened the day prior, and they find a bag belonging to Brian. The officer finds the book bag and the remains nearby the book bag. We know now that it was for sure Brian Laundrie. So then today, Brian Ensign went and spoke with Northport, Josh Taylor again. He asked some questions. He asked about the notebook, and they said that they think it's salvageable, which is great. I'd love to know what's in it. They also said they think it's purely coincidence the Laundries found Brian's personal items at the reserve, and they are absolutely sure that they did not plant any items. And I guess he was asked about following Brian in the Mustang when he went to the reserve. And he said that they never followed Brian in the Mustang when he went to the reserve. I'm not really sure why this question was even asked, because, I mean, if they followed him to the reserve, then they would have known where he was, right? Or they would have seen him. They would have been tailing right behind him. So, I don't know why they asked that, but they did. Or Brian did, sorry. And this is when they also, basically disputed Stephen Bertolino's claim that he called in Brian going missing on the 13th. But again, Stephen said he called the FBI. Now, what am I pissed off about besides Stephen Bertolino's claims that has me just stressed out in my brain? Because I'm like, oh my God, is this true? If this is true, seriously, it's so wrong. So that was really bothering me yesterday. So I'm getting prepared to talk about Northport. And what do you know? Brian Enton, who doesn't know me and I don't know him, he posts a tweet about 3 hours ago that says, one of the things I held off on reporting but now will because Brian Laundrie is confirmed dead is that police installed hidden cameras around the house, including this camera in a neighbor's yard behind the house. This particular camera was installed after Brian went missing. And then just under it, he says, Northport police today talked to me about the cameras. They say there are other cameras that went up sooner before Brian disappeared. Then Brian Enton did a live and he explained that one time he was in the backyard doing a live, and that's the first time he noticed this camera in that neighbor's yard. Apparently this camera is hooked up to a live stream to the police department, okay? And when he started to inspect this camera, Northport police called this neighbor and said, get that reporter out of the yard. So Brian, he's a very ethical reporter because most people would not have withheld this information. They would have, especially a YouTuber, oh my God. If a YouTuber found those cameras, there's no question they would have released that. But Brian is ethical, and he didn't. So, bravo, Brian. So, that happened. And then he said that there was another camera that was planted down the street in what seemed to be a dumpster so they can kind of get a view of the road and watch the comings and goings. That camera was installed in the beginning of the week, he said, so either right before Brian took off or the day Brian took off, and the one in the neighbor's backyard was the night of the 17th when they found out Brian was missing, or the next day. So now we have to say, okay, if this dumpster one was planted the day before or the day of Brian going missing, and you were doing live surveillance on him, how the hell did he get away? How? You had a camera set up. And this goes back to Josh kept saying, we can't do surveillance on residents. We can't do surveillance on citizens. And he was trying to paint this like they can't watch this dude when they absolutely can. And this actually proves it. So he was lying for whatever reason. That was his motive. Maybe he wanted the parents to think or Brian to think that they can't watch them. That's possible. But we know that they were because they planted a freaking camera, for God's sake. Oh, are you kidding me? And then you have to wonder if they did it prior to Brian going missing and them knowing about it. Okay, so you did it in the backyard and you did it down the street. Then did you just assume he was going to take off? Why were you actually... What was the concern, I'm curious, of setting up these cameras, right? Because in my head, I'm like, great. So you're watching him to make sure that he doesn't go anywhere and you can keep tabs on him. Wonderful. I'm just curious what their mindset and what their motive was behind deciding to do this. Was this in place of setting up a patrol officer nearby to watch the coming and goings? Was this to save resources or money or some sort. We know Brian didn't go out the back of the house. He left in the Mustang, so he had to leave the front of the house. So where was this other camera? Was it only on one side of the road looking down, and therefore he went the opposite way and it didn't catch it? What the hell's going on? So all this time, none of us knew that they had these cameras, and I have to laugh a little bit because the neighbor's camera was planted in the house behind their house, which means when all the garden bed, hand coming up out of the garden bed theories was going on, they had full camera view of the backyard, and they would have known if Brian was in a bunker. And kudos to Brian Ensign as well. He put Josh Taylor on the spot and said, Northport has gotten a lot of heat. Do you think if there was mistakes, made, do you take any responsibility for that? And Josh Taylor admitted, sure. And he said what I said in the beginning of this video, where he basically said, human error, things happen. It wasn't like intentional if something did happen. And then he said, things happen. That's how he ends it, which is very a nonchalant thing to say. I mean, Brian getting away didn't stop Gabby from being deceased. I mean, she was deceased already, so it didn't really matter. But there was a family out there who for weeks now was hoping that Brian would be found and that they can see him in a courtroom and then eventually possibly have the comfort of knowing he's in a jail cell for the rest of his life. And they were counting and, relying on law enforcement to find him if he was alive. We now know that he was deceased. So to say, well, things just happen, well, this is a rather big thing, Josh, okay? Because there was a family out there who really wanted to see some justice. So little mistakes are a big deal to a family like that, okay? So let's not just blow it off like, oh, it happens. Yeah, it does, but let's just be a little bit more sympathetic that these little mistakes cause a very big issue. And then, of course, it resulted in Brian's death, which is not his fault. It's not anybody's fault. He made a decision to do what he did to Gabby. He made a decision to do whatever he did to himself. And I keep saying it like that because I don't see that he just went in there in the reserve that he has been to a bunch of times and he happened to get eaten by an alligator this time. I think he ended his life. So then you also have now, when the remains were found, the lawyer lets him know, like, hey, they want to go search for their son in the morning. They're like, thanks for the heads up. They meet them out there. It was one representative from the FBI and one representative from Northport, and they were searching with the parents. And it's the parents that on one side finds the bag, and then it was the officer who was searching with them on the other side who then all of a sudden now finds the remains and the backpack. Yet, when they did the press conference later that day, Josh takes the podium and he's basically talking about, well, him and the FBI agent, basically talking about what a great job they all did. What? Yeah, you busted your butt, that's for sure. You seem to have wasted a great deal of time and resources. You definitely worked, though, that's for sure. Or at least the people who were out there with the gators and the snakes and stuff did. But to kind of pat yourselves on the back after it took the parents going there and finding this one piece of item in under an hour, probably not the good time to do that. And then the next day, Lee County rep takes the podium. He's like, oh, I'll talk to the press in a few minutes. And he comes out and the poor press is thinking they're going to get all this information. And all they do was basically pat each other on the back. So he's like, I can't speak highly of blah, 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 blah. They did such a phenomenal job, this, and that. And then he goes to make this point like, I couldn't be more proud of Chief Garrison. And I think he was doing that because Chief Garrison has got a lot of slack for the fact that he said that, yes, they were watching Brian, or that they knew where Brian was on the 16th when we know that Brian was already gone for 3 days now and most likely had been dead for 3 days. And then Chief Garrison does the same. He takes the podium, says, oh, what a wonderful job they did. And then the Lee County guy does again, and then they walk off camera. And the way I took this was kind of like they were trying to do some form of damage control. That's how I took it. Because they kind of did like a curtain call where you come and you bow to the audience type of situation. And it's like, really? That's it? You're just going to, thank each other? You couldn't do that privately? A little odd, but okay. Do I think mistakes were made? Yeah, I do. I really do. Do I think anybody should be fired? Well, not necessarily, but I mean, if something was a huge mess up, yeah, then maybe. Do I think that things need to be handled differently in future cases because of this case? You're damn straight I do. So let's just go back over that one more time very quickly. Originally, Joe Petito wanted to file her missing with Norport. She was a resident of Norport. She lived at that home. They got directed to where Nicole Schmidt lives at Suffolk County. And up there, they wouldn't file her missing. So then she had to go back the next day, and then she got her filed as missing. And then they go to the home. They see the van. They get to the door. The lawyer's there. Numbers handed to them. They claimed originally they didn't see Brian. They did see Brian. They couldn't speak to him. Then they said, oh, no, that's not true. Chief Garrison said they were watching him and knew where he was. That turned out to not be true. We're now finding out that they actually planted cameras on the day that Brian went missing, most likely before he went missing, and also after they found out on Friday that he went missing. But according to Stephen Bertolino, they did know on the 13th that he went missing because he called the FBI, but Norport's saying, well, we didn't know about it, so something happened there. And then you got Josh Taylor saying they were 100% sure that Brian was at the home at some point. We also had Josh Taylor saying that we can't do surveillance on residents and citizens. We now know that was a bunch of BS that he was feeding us, and most of us knew that was because we now know about the cameras, which means that they can do that, and we don't really know why and for what reason he was saying that when it wasn't true. Then we have all this time spent in the Carlton Reserve searching all these areas, even though they were told exactly the areas that Brian liked to visit. And even if that area was underwater, didn't they, you called in the dive team on one of the days. Why not use the dive team in the areas that are underwater that the parents said that he went to? I don't understand. I mean, I'm not law enforcement, so I'm not going to pretend like I know how it all works. It just doesn't make sense to me that it's like, oh, it's underwater. Let's just skip over this part, even though that's where the parents said he probably is, and let's go in the middle of the reserve. But whatever. So then you have the whole search, and then you have his remains being found in under an hour by the parents. Overall, in my opinion, everything went wrong in this case. I just don't understand how this happened the way it did. But maybe once we get more answers and more clarity on things, I won't feel that way. But right now, I just feel utterly annoyed and pissed off. Especially after finding out about these cameras. Because I'm like, are you serious? Like, all along you had these freaking cameras and you were trying to pretend like you can't watch this dude? You had no problem watching him after he went disappearing into the reserve, because that's when one of the cameras were set up at the neighbor's house, was that night or the day after that they found out he was missing. And the other one was at the beginning of the week, the day that Brian went missing. So, why did you lie? What was the motive? So now I can't really trust what the hell Northport and Josh Taylor say, to be honest with you. So when people are like, Stephen Bertolino lied, they didn't report him missing, I don't believe him, I can't believe a word he says. I believe more of Steve than I do of Josh at this point. I really do. But really, at the end of the day, I don't know who the hell to believe. Anyways, So Brian's autopsy was done at the medical examiner's office, and no cause of death or manner could be determined, so they sent him off to an anthropologist so they can try to figure out what happened. It sounds like there really wasn't much left of Brian, which is really gross to think about, but it definitely sounds like he was in many pieces spread out over the area. So not only is Brian gone, but he's gone, like practically all gone. And I'm not going to put this on to anybody because nobody should have to have this on their head. But Josh Taylor said, quote, "We missed him going out there," unquote. So you have to wonder to yourself, what if they didn't miss him going out there? And what if they did follow him to the reserve? Then what? They couldn't arrest him for nothing. Could they have prevented him taking his own life if he did? Possibly. If they were following him, right behind him to the reserve and tailing him very closely. And the parents, Stephen Bertolino, came out today or last night, and he said that right before Brian left for the reserve, Brian was very upset. And he said he was going hiking. And now, of course, in hindsight, Chris Laundrie is feeling guilty. I'm sure Roberta is too, that they didn't try to stop him from going. Maybe they really didn't think that he would do something like that for whatever reason. But in hindsight now, they're just thinking if we would have just stopped him, this wouldn't have happened. So you have Northport, who could have followed him, and the parents who could have stopped him. At the same time, nobody's really responsible for Brian and his decisions. And if he was going to be set on doing what he did, if he did it, he was going to find one way or another to do it. And if he felt that the police were going to follow him, he probably wouldn't have went there. And if they did, then he probably would have just done it in his home on another day. So this might have just ended up the way it ended up, regardless of anything. But you can't help the what ifs. You always have parents who, after the fact, say, he was upset, but I didn't think he was upset enough to hurt himself. I thought he was just upset because Gabby was missing. Or I'm putting words in their mouth. But, and so he wanted to go for a hike to clear his head. This could have been their thought process. But when you know what happened, then you look back at it and you think, if only I had done this. And then Northport will go through that, like, if only we hadn't missed him and we did follow him to the reserve. Not that they wanted Brian to live, they just could have done something to prevent that from happening so that the only person of interest in Gabby's disappearance didn't end up dead and, leaving this earth with all the answers. So that's it. This is my third video I made tonight. I did one on somebody who's missing in Belfast, Maine. Please listen to that. I did one update on the Murdaugh story that has a 911 call that was just released that I go over. And now I just did this one. And tomorrow I have plans to have a boat ride to go see dolphin sightseeing. So I need to get to bed. And I will definitely be back tomorrow after I get home. So until next time, I'll see you soon.